Hello and welcome to Byju's IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. In this article, the writer talks about the challenges in urban development and envisions the future of smart city development in a post-pandemic era. See, in India, the process of urbanization has happened largely in an unplanned haphazard manner. Even though urban planning was initiated in the 1960s and 70s through the third and fourth 5 year plans, our cities still face a critical deficit of almost all essential infrastructure, be it water supply, waste management, or public transportation. All of them are found to be inadequate. And this inadequate infrastructure, accompanied with explosion in urbanization post 1990s, has led to severe challenges in urban management, including massive traffic, environmental pollution and degradation, accompanied with an overall decline in the quality of living in Indian cities. To tackle these challenges in urban development, the Government of India has launched several urban development schemes over the years, including the latest schemes such as Amrut, Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban, and Smart Cities Mission. Amrut stands for Atal Mission for Rejuvenation and Urban Transformation. This scheme was brought out to provide basic services in urban areas such as water supply, sewage, urban transport, etc. The focus of this scheme is to prioritize the building of essential amenities in cities in order to improve the quality of life. Then the focus of the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana Urban is to provide housing for all in urban areas. But the focus of this article is on the Smart Cities mission, and the writer is trying to evaluate the relevance of such a mission with regard to urban development, especially during the pandemic era. See, these urban development and urban rejuvenation programs, they fall under the administrative control of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs. The Smart Cities mission in particular, which is the focus of our discussion, happens to be a centrally sponsored scheme which was announced by Prime Minister Modi in 2015 and was formally launched in 2016. Since it's a centrally sponsored scheme, a large part of the funding comes from the center along with a state component. But the overall design of the project comes from the center, and the state governments and the urban local bodies are the ones which will be implementing this project. Under this mission, 100 smart cities were selected from around the country through a challenge with the objective of turning these cities into symbols of efficiency, speed, and scale, unlike the inefficient urban areas that we are used to in India. The Smart Cities mission envisions a techno-centric model or a technology-driven model through which the upcoming smart cities and their civic services shall be integrated, connected, and data-driven by employing a variety of sensors, with the whole architecture being enabled by ICT or information communication technology. The key focus of the mission is to improve the delivery of services in cities by employing technology, especially smart technology, and its primary motive is to create an integrated service delivery model. The mission not only envisions improvement in physical infrastructure such as roads, footpaths, etc., but it also focuses on interconnecting services by employing technological tools such as CCTV cameras, GPS sensors, GIS mapping, pollution tracking sensors, health indicators, etc. And all the data that is collected through the smart network gets integrated into the integrated command and control center, which is coming up in each and every smart city. As of now, around 70 such command centers have become operational, and these are state of the art facilities which provide for a centralized command control system where all the essential key data is displayed in a dashboard format, and it enables the civic agencies and the city planners to provide better services to the people. While this technology driven model is appreciable, the writer does point out that this model is largely driven based on the Western model of urban planning. While such integration of services through collection of data does help in effective collection of all relevant information and its dissemination, and while it also helps in carrying out predictive analysis to predict the challenges and issues of the future, it does fall short when it comes to serving a genuine social purpose. While the writer is appreciative of the scheme and the dedicated funding that has been provided for the scheme, he does point out to its shortcomings as well, which became very much evident during the pandemic. As the pandemic broke out, the delivery of healthcare services became the top priority for India's urban local bodies. And the smart cities, which had already established their integrated command and control centers, quickly turned them into war rooms where all the relevant pandemic related information could be collected and disseminated to provide timely healthcare services to the citizens, along with predictive analysis to gauge the extent and the spread of the pandemic in each city. While these command and control centers, which had been turned into war rooms, did help a few cities deliver better services during the initial stages of the pandemic, its ineffectiveness was completely exposed during the second wave, where almost every Indian city failed in its pandemic response because the city's healthcare system and the urban local bodies had simply failed to gear up the urban healthcare infrastructure. And this serves as an example to highlight the shortcomings of an entirely technology driven mission, which is highly centralized and directly driven by the center. Yes, under the Smart City project, a number of achievements have been made with a lot of improvement in service delivery, but many of the projects which have been executed are largely showpiece projects where either the center or the states or the urban local bodies are trying to show off, even though many of these expensive projects fail to serve a social purpose. He points out that top urban planning experts around the world agree that cities of the future should not just be technology driven, but they should also turn out into holistic and elegant cities which serve the basic needs and requirements of the citizens. The writer says that the true focus or the primary objective of any urban development project should be on addressing the key challenges in urban development, such as mobility and transport, providing enough focus on public transportation and promoting pedestrianism, and encouraging the usage of bicycles with the required infrastructure as a healthy and environment friendly alternative. The true focus of these projects and missions should be on efficient traffic management and pollution control, and urban local bodies in particular have to be empowered by these projects and missions so that they are able to deliver basic infrastructure and services which are essential to improve the standard of living in a city. Essentially, the focus of these missions and projects should be on the specific challenges being faced by each city, such as urban flooding, heat waves, or the formation of heat islands in cities, poor quality of water and inadequate water supplies, inefficient and unresponsive healthcare system, especially considering that we are living through a pandemic, efficient transportation and mobility solutions that are environment friendly. So, like this, basic infrastructure and services that are needed for the citizens should be the primary focus of any urban development project. And while technology can definitely be a great enabler and catalyst in improving service delivery and efficiency, it should not become the sole focus of any mission because a top heavy centralized approach can result in the sidelining of genuine grassroots issues and could lead to unnecessary expenditure on expensive technologies which may not truly serve a social purpose, thereby failing to improve the quality of life in the cities. The true focus of urban development should be on basic civic issues, including the creation of common public spaces, where the inhabitants of the city can come together and create a cohabitable space with nature. For this to happen, there should be democratic planning in our smart cities. And instead of a centralized top down model, there needs to be a structural shift in our thinking towards urban development and urban planning. And we need to envision cities that are built at the grassroots. And in any such plan, the people of the city, its society, culture, and nature should be at the very center of such planning. Now, let's take up this article from page number 7, which contains an interview with two leading economic experts who evaluate the performance of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of 2016. See, this law was necessitated due to the huge pileup of non performing loans or non performing assets of banks and due to the delays in resolving this debt. Before this law was brought in, debt resolution in the country was taking roughly between 5 to 6 years, thereby incurring huge losses to the banks and the creditors, and this in turn would threaten the stability of the financial system itself. Compared to this, in developed countries like US and UK, debt resolution hardly takes around 1 year, where the borrower who has defaulted on his payment is brought under a resolution plan along with their assets. And through the resolution plan, either the holdings of the borrower is sold off to another promoter or the assets are liquidated in order to recover the losses being incurred by the creditor on the account of non-repayment of these loans by the borrower. So the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code of India applies to companies, partnerships, and even to individuals in some cases. And it essentially provides for a time-bound process to resolve insolvency. So those companies and partnerships which have become insolvent, or those companies which have gone bankrupt, and if they are not able to pay their loans, that is if they default on their repayments, then the creditors can push for a resolution by trying to gain control over the assets of the borrower. Under the IBC law, both the borrower and the creditor can start the recovery proceedings against each other, and the law prescribes a clear-cut time frame to complete the process of resolution. These proceedings are regulated by the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Board of India with the help of licensed insolvency professionals. And once a resolution plan is worked out, the final proceedings are adjudicated by the National Company Law Tribunal. And as per the procedure laid out under the law, the resolution plan is put into action and the assets of the borrower is liquidated or sold off so that the creditors are able to recover at least a part of their funds. To further understand the IBC in detail, you can go and watch one of our videos, and the link for the same shall be shared in the description box below. But here, the focus of our discussion is to understand the performance of this law and what lies ahead for IBC and stressed asset resolution as per these experts. See, with regard to the performance of the law, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code has definitely speeded up recoveries and resolutions. And today, on an average, insolvency resolution is being completed in India in a time span of 3 years. Earlier, this used to happen in a time span of 5 to 6 years. So definitely, this points to the success of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, and it has helped banks and financial creditors to reduce their NPAs. But however, despite this improvement in insolvency resolution, there are several challenges that lie ahead. For example, one of the biggest challenges with regard to resolution is that most of the companies in India are owned by the promoters and they are also operated by the promoters. This usually doesn't happen in developed countries. In developed countries, the companies are run by professionals and the ownership of the company is widespread, with the promoters having only a basic stake in the company. But in India, the promoters are the owners and as well as the operators of the company. So this usually creates complex challenges in the resolution process because the promoters would not like to give up their ownership even after resolution, and through many methods and routes, they'll try to take back control of the company. This is absolutely unacceptable, especially if the borrowers are willful defaulters. If there is a willful default on the part of the company, that is, if the company has chosen not to repay the loans even though it had the capacity to do it, then in such cases, the promoters or the owners cannot be allowed to take control of the company again after the resolution of the loans. So to prevent this from happening, few checks and balances were introduced into the IBC by amending the law later, and Section 29A was added for this purpose. This section was introduced in 2017 to check attempts by the promoters of insolvent companies to regain control of the company by forcing the creditors to take massive haircuts. Haircuts are nothing but the losses that the banks and the creditors have to accept, because usually in the resolution process, complete recovery is not possible. The resolution process only provides for a partial recovery of the loans, and the extent of cut incurred or the loss incurred by the bank or the creditor is the haircut. So while the introduction of this section has helped to an extent in preventing the promoters, especially willful defaulters, from taking control of the company again, the law still faces many challenges in the days ahead. The experts point out the resolution process is getting delayed and the timelines are not being met because there is a backlog of cases that are piling up. So, to speed up adjudication and to resolve these cases as soon as possible, we need more national company law tribunals and more members have to be appointed. But unfortunately, even though there are many vacancies, there are a lot of delays in appointing the members to the tribunals. The government can even consider adding more benches to the National Company Law Appellate Tribunal, which hears the appeals against the decisions of the National Company Law Tribunals. So essentially, the tribunal capacity has to be increased by creating more tribunals or by adding more benches and by speeding up appointments. Thereupon this, the insolvency proceedings is also facing challenges in implementation. These delays in implementation will have to be sorted out, and the resolution process has to be enforced and implemented within the strict timelines that have been prescribed. The next concern is with regard to the extent of haircuts that banks and creditors are expected to take when resolutions are carried out. See, the extent of haircut incurred by them is entirely dependent on the quality of the assets and as well as on the extent of debt and the kind of guarantee that the borrower has provided to the creditor. If the borrower owns high quality assets of high value, and if their debt is manageable, and if they have provided durable guarantees, then the creditor can hope to recover the losses as much as possible by taking minimal haircuts. But if the asset quality itself is questionable, if the company itself has gone entirely bankrupt, and if its assets have no value, then during liquidation, it will not fetch any considerable value, thereby resulting in excessive haircuts and losses to the creditors. So the experts are of the opinion that there is definitely scope for improvement in the law, and the IBC can be strengthened, particularly to ensure strict adherence to timelines, which currently is being missed. And they even suggest a few possible relaxations under Section 29A as far as resolution plans are concerned. As we discussed earlier, this section was added through an amendment in order to prevent promoters from taking over the company, especially if they are willful defaulters. But this section has provided for very broad definitions, and all kinds of promoters are prohibited from seeking control of the company again. This is where the experts call for an exemption to be made to provide an opportunity to those promoters who are seen to be responsible with regard to their repayment, and in cases where insolvency and bankruptcy has arisen only due to losses incurred by the company and not due to mismanagement or willful default on the part of the owners and the promoters. Right now, Section 29A prohibits all promoters from seeking control of the company. This, according to the experts, is slowing down the resolution process because in some cases, there aren't enough investors or buyers who are looking to take control of the assets of the defaulter. So if the default is not willful, and if there is no mismanagement on the part of the promoters and the owners, then they should be given an opportunity to seek control of the company through the resolution plan. And this requires some relaxations to be provided under Section 29A. Then the experts welcome the government's proposal to establish a National Asset Reconstruction Company or a bad bank, which can help in speeding up stressed asset resolution. See, currently, a stressed asset remains a stressed asset unless and until it is resolved through the long drawn out resolution process. So till then, the burden of the stressed asset lies on the bank or the creditor. So to reduce the burden on the banks and the creditors, the government has proposed the establishment of a bad bank or a national ARC, which will step in case of insolvency and bankruptcy and take over the bad asset entirely, thereby reducing the burden on the bank. Later, the national ARC will decide whether to restructure the loan and to restructure the asset, or to entirely sell off the asset to liquidate the assets in order to recover the borrowed money. So they welcome the proposal to establish a bad bank as it will reduce the burden on the banks and the financial institutions, and it could also help speed up the process of resolution. So in conclusion, the IBC has been functioning quite well. It has helped India to speed up its resolution of bad loans and non-performing assets. But still, there are several shortcomings in the law which can be addressed through legal amendments. And apart from that, to speed up resolution, the capacity of the tribunals has to be increased as recommended by the experts. And the government should also consider bringing back some of the pre-IBC era resolution methods which were also quite effective. Because resolving all stressed assets under the IBC will end up straining the system, thereby leading to delays in resolution. The experts suggest that not all stressed assets need to be resolved under the IBC process. Even before IBC was introduced in 2016, there were few resolution mechanisms that were there which had worked successfully. In the pre-IBC era, there were mechanisms where the borrower, the creditor, along with the promoters and other stakeholders could work out a solution amongst themselves in order to speed up the resolution process. So such pre-IBC resolution mechanisms should also be considered in order to speed up the resolution of stressed assets. Now let's look at an article from page number 8. The Union Law Ministry has notified an ordinance which prohibits the employees of essential defense services from carrying out agitations or strikes. The Essential Defense Services Ordinance 2021 has been notified, and even the President has assented to the ordinance. This prohibition has been brought in the context of the planned protests by the employees of ordnance factory boards, which produces essential military equipment and ammunition for the armed forces. Recently, the government has proposed a set of wide sweeping reforms to the ordnance factory boards in order to make them more efficient and competitive. As per these plans, the ordnance factory boards are being divided into 7 state-owned corporations to improve its accountability and efficiency. And this is being seen as an attempt towards corporatization of the OFBs by the employees and the worker unions. So they have given a call for a strike in order to express their opposition against these proposed reforms. But the government has brought in an ordinance that prohibits their right to strike and makes it a punishable offense. This development brings us to the topic of right to strike. Please remember that right to strike is not a fundamental right. It is just a statutory right or a legal right that has been provided for under the Industrial Disputes Act. Right to strike is slightly different from right to peaceful protest, which is a guaranteed fundamental right under Article 19. See, the right to peacefully organize a protest and the right to carry out a peaceful movement or to form an association is a part of freedom of speech and expression that is guaranteed under Article 19. But however, right to strike is not a fundamental right because a strike involves complete disruption in the functioning of a factory or an industry. So right to strike has been recognized as an industrial right under necessary laws, but however, it is not a fundamental right. So through this ordinance, the government is looking to curb the right of these essential defense services to stage a strike against these proposed reforms, because such agitations and strikes amongst essential defense services could hamper India's defense production and thereby threaten India's national security. It would also be important to remember that members of armed forces enjoy limited fundamental rights as a result of Article 33 and Article 34. While employees of ordnance factory boards are not members of armed forces, their work definitely falls under the definition of essential defense services, and the government has sought to prohibit their right to strike, which is a legal right, by bringing in this ordinance, which has been notified by the President. Now let's take up an article from page number 11, which makes a reference to the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. This topic is in news because India has sought the Maldivian government to take action on those who are behind media reports and social media posts which have targeted Indian diplomats in the country. Of late, India's growing involvement in Maldives has generated a few anti-India sentiments, and few sections of the media and few elements in Maldives are reportedly targeting Indian diplomats and India on social media posts and as well as through inflammatory articles in the media. So the Indian government has asked the Maldivian government to take action against them by reminding the Maldivian government about its obligations to protect the Indian High Commission in Maldives and its staff, including Indian diplomats, as per the obligations of the Vienna Convention. The Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations is an international treaty that provides for a framework for diplomatic relations between countries. It was adopted in 1961 by the UN Conference on Diplomatic Intercourse and Immunities, which was held in Vienna, Austria. This convention basically provides for a set of privileges and immunity, that is legal diplomatic immunity, to diplomats and as well as to a country's diplomatic mission. These privileges and this immunity extends to the High Commission or the embassy, that is the diplomatic premises, including the consulates. It also extends to the diplomats themselves who are working in foreign countries. It also extends to their place of residence, the diplomatic cars, diplomatic baggages, and diplomatic couriers. All these diplomatic entities and assets are protected under the Vienna Convention, and these privileges and legal immunity is granted to ensure that diplomats are able to freely function in the country where they are posted without any fear of coercion or harassment by the host government. Under this convention, diplomats are held to be inviolable and hence they cannot be detained or arrested. The host governments have an obligation to protect not just the diplomats from any attacks or harassment, but they also have an obligation to protect the diplomatic premises, including the high commissions and the embassies, and as well as all diplomatic residences, including diplomatic cars, diplomatic bags, and packages. Under this convention, the host government is prohibited from entering the diplomatic premises and from searching the premises. Host governments, including their security agencies, they cannot seize property or documents inside diplomatic premises. And at any cost, diplomats should be provided with free communication without any restrictions. And even their diplomatic bags and couriers cannot be opened by the host governments. Through this immunity, diplomats cannot be prosecuted or punished by the host government for any of their actions carried out on foreign soil during their line of duty. This diplomatic immunity granted by the Vienna Convention can be waived off only by their governments. But however, the host countries, that is the host governments, have been given the right to expel diplomats and envoys if they are found to be engaged in activities which are not covered under diplomatic immunity. That is, if diplomats are involved in intelligence operations or if they are involved in subversive acts, then under Article 9 of the Convention, these diplomats can be declared as persona non grata, which essentially forces the home country to withdraw those diplomats within a stipulated time, after which they lose their diplomatic immunity entirely. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: the pandemic has come as a remarkable opportunity to review the paradigm of smart cities. Examine. The second question: the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, notified in 2016, has been the key mechanism for addressing corporate distress and the accumulation of bad loans in the financial sector since its implementation. Discuss its effectiveness and the way forward. Kindly write an answer for these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.